Welcome to Tech Ascent, the podcast where we dive into the trends, strategies, and success stories that are reshaping the tech landscape as we know it today. I'm your host, Oliver Clingain. I'm also the founder of Ascenxion, the premier biz development partner within tech. Today, I'm joined by Matt Tharp, the CEO of Hunter.io. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Oliver. Good to be here. Good to see you.
Pleasure to have you on. Would you mind telling the audience a little about what you do with Hunter and what you do as your background?
Yeah, so I'm the CEO of Hunter. Hunter's been around for about 10 years. I joined a couple of years ago. And, my goal for Hunter is to kind of lead us through this next growth phase and hopefully get us to a $100 million business. We're bootstrapped, which is awesome. But it obviously means, we sort of grow at a different pace. And so my job is to just try to tease as much out of that as humanly possible. And in terms of my background, so I've been in tech, software, specifically startups for probably the last 20 years. I've co-founded a couple things, had a nice exit, got acquired by LogMeIn, worked at LogMeIn, which was publicly traded for a couple of years. So I've got a chance to see things at that scale. And, launched my own startup, raised money. And so, I've kind of touched on all the different aspects of leading a tech company. And I've tended to be towards the sort of early edge of what's going on. So I was in AI pre-ChatGPT. I did crypto. I helped a cannabis company with their kind of point of sale kind of rebuild or redesign. And then even earlier than that, my first tech startup was in 03, 04. And, we were building SaaS applications before we knew if it was going to be called SaaS applications or ASP.NET or hosted software. And so, what I figured out 20 years ago that's been true ever since is I really like taking things that have been technically difficult and making them really accessible to people, whether that's small businesses or sort of prosumer businesses. Those are the kinds of things that, that I typically like to.
So, Matt, it sounds like you've touched on nearly every part of the tech space throughout your journey. Now you're the CEO of Hunter. You said you're pushing towards $100 million. What's the difference between being a CEO of a big growing company as opposed to a founder of a small tech startup?
The amount of data that you have. The thing with 0 to 1 is you're operating with sort of nothing but ambiguity, right? Everything you're doing is in the absence of data. That's just kind of the nature of 0 to 1. And so, in the very early days, the soundness of the vision, the level of cooperation of your design partners are really what make or break you. If you have the right vision and you get the right set of early customers that can help you validate that vision in a way that makes it more broadly appealing, then all you have to do is not screw it up at that point. And that's easier said than done. But I think the difference there is when you kind of transition to something that's been successful, you're trying to grow it faster. You're trying to essentially change the behavior of the organization. And when you're doing that, you have to think about not just behavior change of the customer or the user, but the behavior change of the team. And so you kind of have to think about the whole operation differently than you do in 0 to 1. In 0 to 1, you're trying to create everything for the first time. And so there's fewer habits to break. When you're in an established company, once you pass 10 million, you're successful, right? That's a real business, especially if you're profitable. That's a real business. And so the thing that you have to figure out how to do is, how do I take it from 10 to 20 without ruining it? How do I take it to 10 to 20, change the things that need to be changed, don't break the things that are good and working? But that's hard, right? Because you're a small company, you're trying to invest in new opportunities. And often what happens is you change too aggressively or too fast, or you make bad bets. And that's tricky. And of course, by the time you get to, let's say you've passed $10 million, your competition exists as well. A lot of times in the 0 to 1 stage, you're operating against incumbents who are, as incumbents often are, slower moving, typically dealing with legacy features, legacy tech, can't move as fast. And so coming in and sort of disrupting something from the outside is much easier because it's easy for people to jump on that bandwagon and get excited about that disruption. But when you have to sort of disrupt yourself, that is a harder activity because you have to be a little bit more careful and you do it. And sort of disrupting internally versus externally can be really challenging. And so I think There's lots of things that are different. I mean, I could certainly talk about it far too long, but it's a really interesting challenge. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. And going from that, we'll call it that 10 to 20 range. You mentioned earlier you were bootstrapped as well. How is that navigating as a bootstrapped company compared to maybe in the past you've had that funding? How does that change even the mindset as a CEO?
It's so different. So there's a couple of key differences that will seem obvious. So I'll use those as examples. So the first is when you're bootstrapped, you don't have funding rounds to generate energy. And that means whether that's PR or, whatever, it's like when you're coming in and you've raised a round of funding, you get sort of automatic press out of that. And so you can generate energy from that because sort of everybody understands at this point, if you're in tech, how to interact with that idea, right? Oh, they raised money. That means something. That's validation. I can engage with that. When you don't raise money, you have to do it in other ways, right? You have to figure out a way to generate energy through product innovation, through, marketing activities, through branding. And sometimes the right answer is don't worry about it too much. Keep focusing on doing the right things, building the right product, and the rest will come. But you're competing against people who are raising money. And so there's this thing, you see this spike like in search terms or in LinkedIn buzz where somebody raises a round of funding and they get a lot of activity. And it's very hard to compete with that when you don't have that mechanism. So I think one of the things that's tricky about growing a bootstrap business is, first of all, that. And so generating your own energy can be tricky, especially in markets like the US, where buzz is, people like the new latest and greatest thing, right? And so raising a round of funding generates that buzz, garners some attention, pulls a lot of eyeballs. And in the US, eyeballs equal money. So that's positive. You need to find ways to work against that. The second thing, and there's many, but I think the second obvious thing is when you're raising money, the point of the money is that it's fuel, right? It's capital that you're supposed to deploy to grow a business. Everybody sort of gets that. That's what it's for. But what you're doing is essentially you're making a bet in anticipation of a change. You're making a bet that you spend this money and that is going to generate a certain return. When you're bootstrapped, you don't get to spend ahead of growth, right? You're much more sort of generating your own fuel. And so because of that, you have to be on the same page about how you're going to grow, where you're going to make those investments. And it's often true that you don't get to make a lot of bets ahead of things, ahead of growth. And so it's trickier. It's a much harder challenge. I think it's a really interesting way to grow a business because it forces you to create value and focus on value. And I think often when you are in a venture-backed startup, it can become very easy to get addicted to hype cycles. And I think that often leads you to build things that don't always generate real value for users. And so I think from my career, from my perspective, I have always enjoyed operating from that perspective. I think that's paid off. I think all of the products that I've helped bring into the world have had a lot of staying power for that reason, but might not have always been the biggest, most exciting thing on the block. So, my goal now is to try to figure out how to do both.
Yeah, no, nice. And as you're going through this competitive landscape, you're obviously going against companies that do have the funding. It's competitive on its own. How are you going about kind of breaking through the noise and separating yourself and showing that Hunter does provide value to customers?
Yeah. Well, I give you a very concrete example. So last year, I'll name names a little bit just because I think the experience is relevant. So like Apollo raised a good amount of money. I want to say it was kind of at the end of 2023. So 2024, I forget the exact timing, but 2024 was essentially the year they were deploying that capital. They brought a lot of energy and a lot of attention with that. And so, here we are trying to compete in that arena. And it's not that we offer exactly the same functionality as Apollo, but if you're making decisions about your go-to-market strategy and you're looking for tools, we're going to get pulled into that decision process. And so what we had to figure out last year, and I think are continuing to try to focus on as a business, is just focus on the underlying value. What is the absolute critical components of what makes Hunter successful? How do we double down on those? Because we're not going to be able to, let's say, spend dollar for dollar to generate energy and attention like Apollo is. So what can we do? My experience is you typically don't try. Don't fight fights that you can't win. If it's a capital spending fight, then don't get in that unless you have the capital to fight the battle. I also don't necessarily always see that translates to the right results. So, for example, it depends on how they deploy the capital. If they focus it primarily on go-to-market, don't focus it enough on product, or they focus it on feature factory. They're just generating features to try to maintain that buzz. This is where products often get a little convoluted. They get a little overwhelming. You've attracted a lot of attention, but maybe you're not delivering that value. And so what ends up happening is I don't mind if a competitor decides to come in and spend all of that capital to bring attention to an industry, provided we have like a solid bedrock of value that we can provide, because ultimately it gives us a long-term opportunity to benefit from it. I think that's largely what we're seeing with our space. Over the last, call it, handful of years, a lot of people came into the space. I think it was really easy to get started. It was really easy to get a little bit of attention, capitalize on a niche, get your first $1 million, maybe $2 million in ARR. Can they then turn that corner? Can they generate a real business from that? Can they figure out how to take that one marketing channel and make that into two? These are hard. These are execution challenges that not just anyone succeeds at. In fact, a lot of times this is where people fail. They get that first little opportunity of success, and then they struggle to pivot out of it. And so I think what we've done is, we focus, for example, on research. When there's a lot of buzz and there's a lot of features, there's a lot of attention, but there's a lot of noise. And so one of the things that we did last year to combat that noise was we invested a lot of our time and our internal resources on first just making the data better. At the end of the day, we're a data business. And so if our data is ultimately better and we can benchmark that, then I think ultimately that will win. We focused on differentiating the data. So I think those were two things that we did solidly. And the third was research. We focused on, look, we have a lot of data, a lot of users, we have history. Let's focus on figuring out what really is true on paper when you analyze actual email performance and lead performance. Let's compare that to what's noisy. And then let's ask decision makers, and then let's figure out where the gaps are. And let's talk to the audience. Let's talk to the market about that from factual point of view. I think, look, it remains to be seen if this is a successful strategy or not. But for me, chasing people into a fight is often the wrong thing unless you're going to outspend them. What's much better is, they have a lot of features. How many of those are really valuable? I've seen this play out in other markets. I think everyone I've ever played in has probably had a situation very much like this. And so the challenge that we face is, okay, if everybody's going to talk about some cool new thing, let's talk about the data. Let's talk about what really matters. Let's talk about what actually drives success, and let's educate users using actual facts. And I think that tends to both help the customer, but it also helps us make better product decisions. And I think ultimately, in the long run, that has staying power in a way that just generating a lot of noise doesn't.
No doubt. And in the long run, like you mentioned, obviously you being the CEO, you want to build towards 100 million. You can't do this on your own. What's kind of the makeup of your team at Hunter?
So we're very product oriented as a team. We are probably half engineering product. That's probably right. And the other half is customer facing. It's support, customer success, account management. We are not sales and marketing heavy. That's another way that we're sort of different. We try to focus on building the right product, building value, and trying to do our best to let that speak for itself. Obviously not marketing, but I just, we're not out there running around beating on people's doors with a lot of sales activity. And I think that also differentiates us a little bit, because I think it means they're not just constantly hearing somebody shilling for Hunter. Usually what that means is when people are talking positively about Hunter, it's for valid reasons and not just because, of the latest buzz or what have you. They're not slipstreaming everybody else's attention. So, again, that means we get less eyeballs, but I think it means that the eyeballs we do get are, I think they understand the trust in the brand, and that the reason we're doing the things that we're doing, I think, are for the right reasons. At least that's what I hope.
Yeah, no, awesome. True organic growth. And so sometimes that's the best kind. Obviously, sometimes we talk about these Goliaths that have gotten funding and then they fall off the face of the earth once the momentum stops.
It's true. It's true. I mean, look, if you can't figure out, I think it's easy to spend other people's money quickly. It's not easy to spend other people's money wisely and other people's money like it's your own. And I think often what happens is startups treat capital like a salve, right? They make decisions about, we'll throw people at it. I'll hire somebody, put them in charge of that, let them figure it out. And I think that's when organizations start to splinter a little because it's really hard to align those people. It's hard to stay aligned, and it often means you're trying to make too many things a priority. So yeah, it's different. Look, I sound like I'm bashing VC. No, I love, like, doing it right is the hard part, though. Not falling prey to the easy answers and the bad habits is the hard part, which is why I think a lot of them, even in spite of raising a ton of money, money doesn't always equal success when it comes to startups. And I think,
yeah, no, and I think that's a big point right there. Is money doesn't always equal success. Of course, it makes it a little easier sometimes, but
indeed, you still have to make good decisions in the end, right? It's still about making good bets. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that sometimes capital, if not used correctly or deployed wisely, tricks you into thinking you're making good decisions. And in the long run, when they fail or when they don't continue to grow at the same rate, it's really hard to reverse engineer what fell apart. And I think it becomes a dangerous crutch, I think. It can be, not always.
For sure, sometimes. And Matt, over the past 20 years since you've been in tech, now you're the, it could be longer, it could be shorter, around that range though.
Yeah.
But over the past couple of decades, what do you think is the biggest lesson you've learned that's kind of led to where you are now as the CEO of Hunter?
Man, the single biggest? Well, right now it's probably the thing that I'm sensitive to, which is that everything takes longer than you want it to, or that you think it should. I think focus, some of these words sort of mean some of the same things. Look, I think ultimately it comes down to two things. It's alignment and prioritization. You've got to make sure that as the company grows, you stay aligned. And that's hard. And even within that alignment, you have to make sure you're prioritizing the most valuable things, which is also hard. I think if you strip away everything else, right, all the processes, all the capital, all of this, it really comes down to that, for lack of, I think, a more eloquent answer. There's lots of ways to do that differently. I think that's the secret sauce of most businesses that figure out scale, is they've figured out how to keep the organization aligned, keep the focuses on the right areas, stay prioritized. And I think, like, there isn't a secret sauce, because every situation is different. This is why playbooks are tricky, right? Just because you hire somebody who worked at a place that was successful, they come in, oftentimes they'll just run the playbook they saw work at that company. But everything's different. And so I think what ends up happening is people rely a little bit too much on repeating playbooks and not enough on trying to figure out what was it about that play that worked. How can I apply those principles differently? How can I learn from that in a way that I can actually kind of reverse engineer it and pick apart the parts that are reusable? Because not all of it is timing. Timing is not reusable. And I think that's something that not a lot of people do. They focus so much on the success that they don't often try to think about why. Why was it successful? What parts of that are repeatable? And I think that's been the fun part of my experience, is I think I've spent a lot of time focused. That sounds bad, but I think I've spent a lot of time trying to focus more on what are universal lessons. What are lessons that can be applied elsewhere that are repeatable in other contexts? And how do I tell the difference? How do I not get distracted by things that ultimately are just the thing that worked at that company that one time?
Yeah, and you got to look at it like a equation almost. You can't credit a single variable, but even though it might be the last variable you solved for, it can't be the one that made the entire equation successful.
Yeah, and humans have a terrible recency bias too. So yeah, it's always going to be the last decision, right? It's I think that we fall prey, like, some of these things are just psychological realities of being human, and I think trying to figure out how to not fall into those traps becomes really.
And Matt, we can start the wrap up here, but looking forward for Hunter.io, you mentioned your goal is 100 million. What's kind of the vision to get there? Without sharing your secret sauce, what do you think? What's on the horizon for your company?
Well, we've got to figure out our place in the changing landscape with AI. What does that mean to our customers? How do we put them in a position to be successful and not just chase bright, shiny objects? I think that's the battle everybody in SaaS is probably trying to figure out right now, or at least they should be. It's not, are you going to be completely disintermediated by AI? Because I don't think most of us will. What is your place in that world? How do you position for that now? And how do you potentially expand that horizon? I think people are going to have to make some risky bets in the short term to position themselves for the next couple of years, because, I'm not an AI maximalist as some are, but I do see the disruption, especially around, frontline workers and frontline worker tasks. So, the BDR function, for example, CS, like there's a lot of people in that who need to be given tools to harness AI instead of having to be worried about combating it. And we also have to recognize that there are some of those activities that might just be better off done by AI. It's just more scalable and more cost effective. And I think the real test is when it delivers a better customer experience. We've got to keep an eye on that. And so I think, that's really the challenge for us, like almost anybody else in SaaS, is how do we position ourselves for that future that is coming very rapidly, and do it in a way that doesn't get too obsessed with, the idea that somehow AI is going to replace all of this. Because I don't necessarily think that that's true.
Yeah, no, doomsday's not coming, but it depends who you ask.
Indeed, it might be. I just don't think it's coming because of this. I mean, yeah.
No, awesome. But Matt, that's all I got for you today. I really appreciate you coming on. And where can the people find you?
Hunter.io, come check it out. Free product, perpetually free. And then as you become successful, you can just upgrade to paid plans. And, we're typically posting things to the blog and LinkedIn. So if you're interested, come check it out.
Nice. And for everybody listening, I'll tag Matt on LinkedIn down in the description. I'll also tag Hunter.io if you guys want to go check him out. But Matt, thank you once again for coming on.
Thanks, Oliver. Great to chat.